In the autumn of 1993, in a quiet community in Ohio, a young mother suddenly vanished, and police found no evidence. More than 27 years later, one small detail reopened the case. It revealed something no one expected. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Now, let's get into today's missing person case. Oak Creek was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors knew each other by their first names. It was a small, working-class town surrounded by dense woods and open farmlands. In 1993, life moved at a slower pace. People got their news from the morning paper, and if you needed to reach someone, you called their home landline and hoped they were there to answer. It was a safe place to raise a family. The streets were lined with large oak trees that turned brilliant shades of orange and red when the weather grew cold. Children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and crime was almost completely unheard of. But underneath that peaceful surface, tragedy was waiting to strike. Sarah Jenkins was 28 years old. She was a single mother who worked incredibly hard to provide for her 7-year-old son, Leo. Sarah was known around town as a kind, soft-spoken woman with a warm smile. She had light brown hair, tired but gentle eyes, and a quiet determination about her. Life had not been easy for Sarah, but she never complained. She worked as a bookkeeper at a local auto repair shop, spending her days organizing files, answering phones, and balancing ledgers. Her entire world revolved around Leo. Leo was a bright, energetic boy who loved space, astronauts, and drawing pictures of rockets. Because it was just the two of them, their bond was incredibly strong. Sarah and Leo were a team. They had their own little routines, their own inside jokes, and a deep, unspoken understanding that they would always take care of each other. Every morning, Sarah would wake up before the sun. She would pack Leo a lunch, usually a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a handwritten note tucked inside, and make sure his backpack was ready by the door. She was the kind of mother who never missed a school play, a parent-teacher conference, or a quiet moment to tell her son how much she loved him. But on one ordinary Tuesday, that beautiful bond was broken forever. Tuesday, October 12, 1993, started like any other day. The air was crisp, and a light frost covered the grass in their small front yard. Inside their modest two-bedroom apartment, the morning rush was underway. Sarah made pancakes for breakfast. She poured Leo a glass of orange juice and reminded him to finish his math homework before he went outside to play for recess. Everything felt completely normal. There was no sense of danger, no lingering fear, and no warning signs that their lives were about to be torn apart. At 7:45 in the morning, they walked out to Sarah's faded blue Ford Escort. The car was old and rattled when it started, but it got them where they needed to go. Sarah drove the short distance to Oak Creek Elementary School. The streets were filled with other parents dropping off their children. Yellow school buses idled by the curb, and kids wearing thick winter coats hurried toward the heavy double doors of the brick building. Sarah pulled up to the drop-off zone. She put the car in park and turned to look at her son. She reached over and adjusted the collar of his jacket. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and kissed him on the forehead. "Have a good day at school, buddy," she said. "I will, Mom," Leo replied, grabbing his backpack. "I'll be right here to pick you up at 3 o'clock, she told him. "I promise." Leo nodded, opened the car door, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He closed the door and began walking toward the school entrance. Before he went inside, he turned around and waved. Sarah waved back, waiting until he was safely through the doors before she put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. That was the last time Leo ever saw his mother. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the school bell rang. The hallways flooded with children eager to go home. The heavy double doors swung open and kids poured out onto the front lawn. Parents were waiting in their cars, waving to their children. Leo walked out to the designated pickup area. He sat down on a green wooden bench near the flagpole. This was their spot. Every single day, without fail, Sarah's blue Ford Escort would be parked right in front of that bench. But today, the space was empty. Leo swung his legs back and forth, watching the cars drive by. He wasn't worried at first. Sometimes his mom got held up at work, or sometimes traffic at the main intersection was slow. He unzipped his backpack, pulled out a library book about the solar system, and started reading. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The crowd of children and parents slowly thinned out. The yellow buses drove away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust. Soon, the front of the school was entirely quiet. By 3:30, Leo was the only child left sitting outside. The crisp autumn wind began to bite at his cheeks. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and kept his eyes glued to the street, waiting to see that familiar blue car turn the corner. A few minutes later, Mrs. Gable, Leo's second-grade teacher, walked out of the building. She was carrying a stack of papers and was heading to her car when she noticed the young boy sitting alone on the bench. She frowned and walked over to him. "Leo, is everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Leo looked up, his big brown eyes filled with confusion. "My mom isn't here yet." Mrs. Gable checked her watch. It was completely unlike Sarah to be late. She was one of the most reliable parents in the entire school. If she was ever going to be delayed, she always called the front office to let them know. "Let's go inside where it's warm," Mrs. Gable said, holding out her hand. "We can call her from the office." Inside the quiet school office, the secretary dialed the number for the auto repair shop where Sarah worked. The phone rang 3 times before the shop manager picked up. "Hi, this is Oak Creek Elementary calling for Sarah Jenkins," the secretary said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah isn't here," the manager replied. "She never came back after her lunch break. I just figured she had an emergency with her kid." A cold wave of dread washed over Mrs. Gable. She looked down at Leo, who was sitting in a plastic chair, kicking his feet and looking around the office. The secretary hung up the phone and immediately dialed Sarah's home number. It rang and rang until the answering machine finally picked up. No one was home. By 4:30, the school principal decided they needed to contact Leo's emergency contacts. They reached out to Sarah's parents, Arthur and Helen, who lived about 20 minutes away on the edge of town. When Arthur and Helen arrived at the school, their faces were pale with worry. Helen rushed over to Leo and wrapped him in a tight hug. "Where's Mom?" Leo asked, his voice trembling for the very first time. "She's okay, sweetheart," Helen lied, fighting back tears. "We're going to find her." Arthur, a retired factory worker with a stern face but a gentle heart, spoke with the principal. They discussed the fact that Sarah was a creature of habit. She loved her son more than anything in the world. She would never, under any circumstances, just leave him sitting on a bench. Something was terribly wrong. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the school parking lot, Arthur drove to the local police station. He walked up to the front desk, his hands shaking, and told the officer on duty that his daughter was missing. Because Oak Creek was a small town, the police did not force the family to wait the standard 24 hours to file a missing person report. The desk sergeant knew Arthur. He knew Sarah. He knew this was completely out of character. Officer Miller, a veteran cop who had worked in the town for 15 years, took the lead on the case. He immediately dispatched 2 patrol cars to drive along the route between the auto repair shop and the elementary school. He thought maybe her car had broken down, or maybe she had been in a minor accident and was stranded on a back road without a phone. But as the hours ticked by, the search turned up absolutely nothing. The sky turned pitch black. The temperature dropped near freezing. Inside Arthur and Helen's house, Leo sat on the living room floor, staring at the front door, waiting for it to open. He refused to eat dinner. He just wanted his mother. At the police station, Officer Miller was making calls to local hospitals. There were no reports of any Jane Does admitted with injuries. There were no major accidents on the highway. It was as if Sarah Jenkins had simply evaporated into thin air. But then just past midnight, the police radio crackled to life. A night shift patrol officer was doing a routine sweep of a large, dimly lit parking lot outside an abandoned grocery store on the very edge of town. The store had been closed for years, and the lot was overgrown with weeds. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, the officer's voice echoed through the radio. "I've got a vehicle matching the description of the missing woman's car, blue Ford Escort, Ohio plates." Officer Miller grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. He drove to the abandoned parking lot with his sirens wailing, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. The blue Ford Escort was parked at a strange angle, halfway across two parking spaces. The headlights were off. Officer Miller grabbed his flashlight and walked slowly toward the vehicle. The driver's side door was unlocked. He shined his light into the dark interior of the car. What he saw made his blood run cold. The keys were still sitting in the ignition. Sarah's purse was sitting perfectly upright on the passenger seat. Her wallet, her driver's license, and all of her cash were still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no muddy footprints. But as Officer Miller moved his flashlight across the dashboard, he noticed something strange, something that made absolutely no sense. Tucked behind the steering wheel was a folded map of the United States. It was open to the state of Florida, and drawn in thick, red marker was a large circle around a small coastal town. Sarah had never been to Florida. She didn't know anyone in Florida. She barely had enough money in her bank account to pay her monthly rent, let alone fund a cross-country trip. Why was her car left abandoned in the dark? And why would a devoted mother who promised to pick up her son walk away from everything she loved? The scene at the abandoned parking lot was grim. As the sun began to climb, the police forensic team swarmed the blue Ford Escort. They dusted every inch of the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the door handles, but their work was frustratingly fruitless. There were no foreign fingerprints, no signs of a struggle, and no evidence that Sarah had been attacked. It was as if she had stepped out of the vehicle and into thin air. Officer Miller stood under the buzzing fluorescent light of the grocery store sign, staring at the map. The red ink was vivid, almost glowing against the dull paper. He showed it to Arthur and Helen later that morning, hopping for a flicker of recognition, but they looked at the map with nothing but confusion. Sarah had never been to Florida. She didn't have the money for a trip, and she had never expressed any desire to move. The map felt like a taunt, a cruel piece of evidence that raised more questions than it answered. The police opened an official investigation, but the deeper they dug, the more they realized how little they actually knew about Sarah Jenkins. She was a woman who lived her life in the shadows of her own routine. She had no close friends in town. She didn't go to bars, she didn't attend social clubs, and she didn't seem to have any secrets. She was just a mother who went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and read bedtime stories to her son. When Miller interviewed her boss at the auto repair shop, the man seemed genuinely shaken. He told police that Sarah was the most reliable employee he had ever had. She arrived at 8, left at 5, and never took a personal call during work hours. On the day she disappeared, he hadn't noticed anything unusual. She had eaten her lunch in the break room as she always did, a sandwich and an apple, and then returned to the ledger. He hadn't seen her leave because she had just stepped out the side door, presumably to grab a quick coffee before the afternoon shift. She never came back. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery of Oak Creek became the town's only topic of conversation. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some people whispered that she had run away from the pressures of being a single mother, despite everyone who knew her insisting that was impossible. Others speculated that she had gotten involved with the wrong person, someone the police hadn't yet identified. The pressure on the police department grew. Every night, Arthur and Helen would sit by their phone, waiting for a call that never came. Leo, now staying with his grandparents, had become a ghost of his former self. He spent his days sitting on the back porch, staring at the woods, drawing pictures of his mother in his sketchbook. He was waiting for her to pull up in her blue car. He was waiting for the promise she made at the school drop-off zone. The police followed every lead. They tracked the map of Florida back to a local bookstore, but the clerk couldn't remember who had purchased it. They checked the serial numbers on her car, her bank statements, and her employment records. Everything was clean, too clean. One afternoon, Miller sat in his small office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He had a file open in front of him, filled with photographs of the apartment. It was a modest, happy home. There were photos of Leo taped to the refrigerator, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, and a small stack of bills sitting neatly on the desk. Miller began to scour through the phone bills again, looking for a pattern, anything that might point to a person she was hiding from the world. Most of the calls were to the school, the grocery store, or her parents. But then, he spotted something. There was a series of calls made in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. They were all made from a public payphone at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Every single one of them was placed late at night, long after Leo was asleep. They were all to the same number. Miller tried calling the number, but it was disconnected. He tracked the exchange through the phone company, only to find that the number belonged to a residential address in a town 3 hours away. He drove there himself the next morning, hoping to find a person who could explain why Sarah had been calling them from a payphone in the middle of the night. When he arrived at the address, he found a rundown house with overgrown grass and boarded-up windows. It had been empty for years. He felt a tightening in his chest. He was running out of time, and the answers seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He returned to the station, tired and defeated. He sat at his desk and sighed, looking at a final box of Sarah's personal belongings that Arthur had brought in from her apartment. He opened the box and began to sift through the contents. It was mostly books, some childhood mementos, and a few old letters from distant relatives. But near the bottom of the box, buried under a pile of old receipts, he found a small, leather-bound notebook. He opened it carefully. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of dates, times, and short, cryptic notes. The last entry was dated the day before she vanished. It was just one sentence, written in a shaky, uneven hand that didn't look like Sarah's neat bookkeeping script. He found out. Miller stared at the words. He didn't know who he was, and there was no further context to explain what he had found out. But the note changed everything. It transformed the case from a mysterious disappearance into a hunt for a person who had been living in fear. He realized then that Sarah Jenkins hadn't been a ghost. She had been protecting herself, and whatever she had been hiding from was closer than anyone in Oak Creek ever imagined. He went back to the evidence table and laid out the photos of the car again. He looked at the map of Florida, then at the notebook, then at the list of calls to the dead number. He looked at the details of the school drop-off. There was one more item in the box, an old, worn envelope that had been stuck to the bottom. Inside was a single black-and-white photograph. It showed Sarah, much younger, standing in front of a building that looked nothing like Oak Creek. Beside her was a man, his arm wrapped around her waist, but his face had been scratched out with a sharp object. This was the clue Miller had been praying for. But as he turned the photo over, he saw a date scribbled in the same shaky handwriting as the notebook. It was a date that had happened 10 years ago, and beneath it, a name he recognized instantly. The name belonged to a man who had died in a tragic car accident in that very same town 2 days after Sarah had moved away. Miller felt a chill creep up his spine. If the man in the photo was dead, then who had Sarah been writing about? Who had found out? And why had she kept this photo for all these years, hidden at the bottom of a box, waiting for the moment when everything would finally fall apart? He reached for his phone, ready to call for backup, but he stopped. He looked at the office door and saw a shadow moving across the frosted glass. Someone was standing in the hall, watching him. The shadow lingered for a moment before moving away. Miller grabbed his gun and bolted to the door, throwing it open, but the hallway was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the station's air conditioning. He rushed to the window, peering out into the parking lot. He saw a man walking quickly toward a dark sedan. It was the same sedan he had seen parked across the street from the elementary school every single day for the past week. He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his coat, jumped into his patrol car, and sped out of the lot, his tires squealing against the pavement. He had to follow that car. He had to know who was watching him, and he had to know what the name on the back of that photograph really meant. As he chased the sedan through the winding roads of Oak Creek, he realized that he wasn't just investigating a missing person anymore. He was chasing a ghost that had been haunting Sarah Jenkins for a decade. And the truth, he suspected, was going to shatter the entire town. The patrol car's engine roared in the quiet night as Officer Miller slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the cold asphalt, leaving thick black marks as he pulled out of the police station parking lot. Ahead of him, the dark sedan was already picking up speed, its red taillights glowing like angry eyes in the distance. Miller gripped the steering wheel tightly. His heart hammered against his ribs. Whoever was in that car had been watching him. They had been sitting across from the elementary school for a week, watching a 7-year-old boy. And now they were running. The chase tore through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Creek. The sedan swerved dangerously around sharp corners, blowing past stop signs and pushing the speed limit far beyond what was safe. Miller kept his sirens blaring, his headlights cutting through the darkness, desperate to catch a glimpse of the license plate. But the driver of the sedan was smart. They kept their lights completely off, blending into the shadows of the road. As they reached the edge of town, the paved road suddenly turned into gravel. The sedan fishtailed, kicking up a massive cloud of thick, choking dust. Miller coughed, squinting through his windshield, but visibility dropped to zero. He hit the brakes to avoid spinning out into the deep ditch alongside the road. By the time the dust finally settled, the night was completely silent. The sedan was gone. It had vanished into the dense, sprawling woods that bordered the county line. Miller stepped out of his car, holding his flashlight, scanning the tree line. There was nothing but the sound of wind rustling through the dead autumn leaves. He had lost them. And with that lost car, the investigation into the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins hit a massive, impenetrable wall. The days dragged into weeks, and the weeks slowly bled into months. The massive search parties that once combed the woods eventually stopped. The flyers taped to the windows of the local diner became faded and torn by the winter snow. The news stations packed up their cameras and moved on to the next tragedy. But for a little boy named Leo, the nightmare was just beginning. Growing up without a mother is a heavy burden, but growing up not knowing if she is dead or alive is a kind of torture that slowly breaks a person down. Leo moved in permanently with his grandparents, Arthur and Helen. They loved him deeply. They did everything they could to give him a normal life, but their home was haunted by a ghost who had no grave. Every single day after school, Leo would sit on the front porch and watch the driveway. He would wait for that old blue Ford Escort to turn the corner. He remembered her promise. She had looked him right in the eyes and said she would be there. His mother never broke a promise. But as the years went by, Leo stopped sitting on the porch. He stopped drawing pictures of her in his sketchbooks. The sharp, agonizing pain of her absence slowly dulled into a deep, quiet sadness. 10 years passed, then 20. Arthur and Helen eventually grew old and passed away, their hearts forever broken by the mystery they could never solve. Officer Miller retired from the police force, his hair turning gray, his shoulders heavy with the guilt of the one case he could never close. He kept a copy of Sarah's file in a cardboard box under his bed, a constant reminder of his failure. 27 years later, the world had completely changed. It was the year 2020. Leo Jenkins was now 34 years old. He had grown into a quiet, thoughtful man. He became a middle school science teacher, finding comfort in the predictable rules of physics and biology. He lived a simple, organized life in a small apartment just a few towns over from Oak Creek. He was a good man, but there was always a shadow in his eyes, a profound emptiness that he could never quite fill. He had long ago accepted that he would never know what happened to his mother. He believed her bones were probably buried in some unmarked grave, lost to time and nature. But Leo was wrong. The past was not dead. It was just waiting for the right moment to speak. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. Leo was sitting at his kitchen table, grading a stack of student science exams. The television was playing softly in the background. Rain was tapping gently against the window glass. Suddenly, his cell phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. The caller ID showed a strange area code. It was a number from Florida. Leo frowned. He didn't know anyone in Florida. He almost sent the call to voicemail, assuming it was just a telemarketer, but something in his gut told him to answer. He picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. "Hello," Leo said. For a long moment, there was nothing but heavy, crackling silence on the other end of the line. Leo was about to hang up when he heard a man take a deep, shaky breath. "Is this Leo Jenkins?" The man's voice was rough, sounding exhausted and deeply nervous. "Yes, speaking. Who is this?" Leo asked, putting his red grading pen down on the table. "My name is David," the man said. "You don't know me, and I am so sorry to bother you, but I am calling from a town called Clearwater down in Florida." Leo's breath caught in his throat. Florida. He remembered the old police reports. He remembered Officer Miller telling his grandparents about the map found inside his mother's abandoned car. A map with a red circle drawn around a town in Florida. "What is this about?" Leo asked, his heart suddenly beating faster. "My father passed away 2 weeks ago," David explained softly. "He was a private investigator back in the 80s and 90s. I've been clearing out his house, packing up his old office. He was a very secretive man. He kept a lot of things locked away." Leo gripped the edge of the kitchen table. His knuckles turned white. He couldn't speak. He just listened. "I found a hidden safe bolted to the floor in his basement," David continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I had to hire a locksmith to drill it open. Inside there were no money or valuables. There was just one single metal lockbox, and written on the top of the box in thick black marker was your mother's name." The room seemed to spin. 27 years of silence shattered in an instant. "There are things in this box, Leo," David said. "Things that do not make sense. I read some of the papers. I saw the photographs. I don't trust the police down here with this. It feels dangerous. If you want to know the truth about your mother, you need to see this." "Where are you?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. "I drove up from Florida. I'm at a motel about an hour away from you," David replied. "Can we meet?" 2 hours later, Leo sat in a brightly lit booth at an all-night diner situated just off the highway. He was not alone. Sitting directly across from him was retired Officer Miller. When Leo had called him, the old policeman had dropped everything. He arrived wearing a faded jacket, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The bell above the diner door jingled. A man wearing a damp raincoat walked in. He looked around nervously before making his eye contact with Leo. It was David. He was carrying a heavy, dark green metal lockbox under his arm. David walked over and slid into the booth next to Miller. He didn't order coffee. He didn't bother with small talk. He simply placed the cold metal box onto the center of the table. "My father was hired to find people," David said quietly, looking between the two men. "People who didn't want to be found. I never knew who his clients were. He never brought his work home. But whatever is in this box haunted him until the day he died." David reached into his pocket, pulled out a small silver key, and unlocked the box. The metal latch popped open with a sharp, heavy click. Miller and Leo both leaned forward. The smell of old, dusty paper wafted up from the open container. Inside the box were dozens of manila folders, stacks of surveillance photographs, and faded yellow legal pads filled with handwritten notes. Miller reached in and pulled out the thickest stack of photos. He spread them out across the diner table. Leo let out a sharp gasp, raising a hand to his mouth. They were pictures of his mother, but they weren't old family photos. They were surveillance shots taken from a distance. There was a photo of Sarah walking into the local grocery store, a photo of her pumping gas into the blue Ford Escort, a photo of her sitting in the park reading a book. And then a photo that made Leo's stomach drop. It was a picture of him. He was a little boy, maybe 6 years old, playing in the front yard. "He was watching us," Leo whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "This man was watching us for months." "He was hired to watch her," Miller corrected, his voice tight. He picked up one of the legal pads and began reading the old investigator's notes. He logged her every move. What time she woke up where she worked, what route she drove to the elementary school. He was studying her routine. Miller dug deeper into the box. Underneath the photographs was a brown folder sealed with a piece of old tape. Written on the front of the folder was a name. It wasn't Sarah Jenkins. It said Margaret Collins. Miller ripped the tape off and opened the folder. Inside was an old, crumbling newspaper clipping from 1983, a full 10 years before Sarah had vanished. The headline read, "Local businessman killed in tragic car fire." Below the headline was a picture of the man who had died. It was the same man from the photograph Miller had found in Sarah's apartment 27 years ago, the one with his face scratched out. Attached to the newspaper clipping was an official state police report. Miller adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the typed words. As he read, his face drained of all color. His hands began to shake violently. "My God," Miller breathed, dropping the paper onto the table. "What is it?" Leo asked, leaning in. "What does it say?" "It wasn't an accident," Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The police report was suppressed. The man in the car was murdered. He was poisoned, placed behind the wheel, and the car was set on fire to cover up the crime." Miller turned to another page in the folder. It was a police mugshot from 1983. The woman in the mugshot had dark black hair and was much younger, but her gentle eyes were completely unmistakable. It was Sarah, or rather, Margaret Collins. "Your mother didn't vanish because someone took her," Miller said, looking at Leo with pure shock. "Your mother was a fugitive. She was the prime suspect in a brutal murder 10 years before you were even born. She changed her name, moved to Oak Creek, and hid." Leo felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. His mother, the gentle, soft-spoken woman who packed his lunches and kissed his forehead, was wanted for murder. "But why did she run in 1993? Leo asked, his voice cracking. "If she had been hiding for 10 years, what changed?" Miller swallowed hard. He reached into the very bottom of the metal lockbox and pulled out a single, neatly folded contract. It was the hearing agreement signed by David's father. It was the document that proved exactly who had hired the private investigator to hunt Sarah down. Miller read the name of the client at the bottom of the page. He stopped breathing. He read it again, praying his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim diner light. "It's right here," Miller said, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. "The private investigator didn't take her. He was just paid to find her location. and once he found her, he handed that information over to the client. "Who was the client?" Leo demanded, leaning across the table, his heart hammering in his ears. "Who paid him to find my mother?" Miller slowly slid the paper across the table. Leo looked down at the signature at the bottom of the page. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was perfectly clear. It was a name Leo had known his entire life, a name that made his blood run completely cold. It was a name that meant the danger was never in Florida. The danger had been sitting at his dinner table for his entire childhood. Leo stared at the faded ink on the bottom of the contract. His breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment the entire diner seemed to fade away. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of the rain against the window, the clinking of coffee cups, it all vanished, replaced by a loud, rushing sound in his ears. "Arthur Jenkins." "That's my grandfather," Leo whispered. His voice was trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "That's my grandfather's signature. He hired the private investigator." Officer Miller didn't say a word. He just reached across the table, picked up the old 1983 police report about the fatal car fire, and placed it right next to the contract. He pointed a thick, shaking finger at the name of the man who had burned to death in that car. "Richard Jenkins." Leo looked back and forth between the two documents. His mind was spinning, desperately trying to reject the truth that was forming in front of him. "Arthur and Helen weren't her parents, Leo," Miller said softly, his voice thick with sorrow. "They were his. Richard was their son." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, terrifying force. Sarah's real name was Margaret Collins. In 1983, she was married to Richard Jenkins. According to the old police reports in the file, Richard was an abusive, dangerous man. The local police had been called to their house multiple times for domestic violence, but charges were never filed. Then one night, Richard's car caught fire on a deserted road. He was found dead inside. Before the police could officially question her, Margaret disappeared. She ran away. She changed her name to Sarah, and she was pregnant with Leo. "She was hiding from them," Leo said, his eyes welling up with tears as the horrifying reality set in. "She ran away to protect me, but my grandparents lived 20 minutes away from us in Oak Creek. We saw them all the time. She told me they were her parents. She told the school they were her parents." "Because she was trapped," Miller explained, wiping a hand across his tired face. "Think about it, Leo. Arthur hired this private investigator to track down the woman who supposedly murdered his son. In 1985, the investigator found her. He found her living under a new name in Oak Creek with a 2-year-old baby, but Arthur didn't call the police. He didn't turn her in. He blackmailed her," David said quietly from the other side of the booth. "My father's notes spell it out. Arthur confronted her. He told her that if she tried to run again, or if she didn't do exactly what he said, he would hand the evidence over to the police. She would go to prison for murder, and Arthur would get full custody of you anyway." Leo felt physically sick. His stomach churned as memories from his childhood flashed through his mind. He remembered Sunday dinners at Arthur and Helen's house. He remembered how his mother always looked so tense, so incredibly tired. She would sit quietly at the edge of the table, barely eating, while Arthur and Helen played with Leo. He remembered the cold, dark way Arthur used to look at Sarah when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't the look of a loving father. It was the look of a warden watching a prisoner. Sarah hadn't just been living a quiet life. She had been living in a psychological hostage situation. She was forced to pretend her abusers were her own loving parents. She was forced to hand her son over to them every weekend, smiling through the terror, knowing that if she made one wrong move, they would take him away forever. "The notebook," Miller said suddenly, his eyes widening. He looked at Leo. "The notebook we found in her apartment after she vanished. The last entry said, 'He found out.' We always wondered who she meant." "She meant Arthur," Leo said, his tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "She was planning to run again. The map of Florida. She didn't abandon her car. She bought that map because she was finally going to take me and escape. She had been saving money in secret. She was leaving on October 12th. David reached into the dark green metal lockbox. His hands were shaking as he pushed aside the folders and photographs. From the very bottom of the box, he pulled out a small, rectangular object. It was a standard microcassette tape, the kind used in old answering machines and handheld recorders. He also pulled out a small, battery-powered tape player. He set it down gently on the diner table, right next to Leo's cold cup of coffee. "My father was paranoid," David explained, his voice barely a whisper. When he realized how dangerous Arthur Jenkins was, he started recording all of their phone conversations. He wanted proof that he was only hired to locate her, not to hurt her. This tape was labeled October 12, 1993. It was recorded at 1:30 in the afternoon, just an hour and a half before your mother was supposed to pick you up from school. Leo stared at the small plastic tape. This was it, the missing piece of time, the conversation that ended his mother's life. David pressed the heavy plastic play button. The machine clicked loudly, followed by a few seconds of raw, hissing static. Then a voice came through the small speaker. It was a voice Leo hadn't heard in over a decade, but he recognized it instantly. It was the deep, gravelly voice of Arthur Jenkins. "Did you check the apartment like I asked?" Arthur's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding breathless and angry. "I did, Arthur," the private investigator replied. "I used the spare key. She's got 2 suitcases packed under the bed, and she bought a map. She's making a run for it. She's leaving for Florida today. If you want the police to arrest her, you need to call them right now." There was a long pause on the tape. The sound of heavy breathing filled the diner booth. "I am not calling the police," Arthur growled, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying tone. "If she goes to trial, there is a chance a jury feels sorry for her. There is a chance she keeps my grandson. I am not letting that woman take my blood away from me again." "Arthur, don't do anything stupid," the investigator warned. "My job is done, I'm out." "I know exactly where she is," Arthur said coldly. "She's at the auto shop. I know her routine. She takes her lunch break at 1:45. She walks out the side door by the alley to get coffee. I am driving there right now. I am going to end this today. She will never see that boy again." The tape ended with a loud click. The diner was dead silent. The truth hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Arthur Jenkins hadn't been a grieving grandfather. He was a monster. He had intercepted Sarah during her lunch break at the auto repair shop. He forced her into his car, murdered her, and then drove her blue Ford Escort to the abandoned grocery store parking lot later that night to stage a disappearance. And then he had gone to the police station. He had sat in the waiting room, crying fake tears, playing the role of a desperate father. He had held Leo in his arms, stroking his hair, comforting the little boy whose mother he had just ripped from the world. Leo covered his face with his hands. A raw, agonizing sob tore out of his chest. His entire life was a lie. The people who raised him, the people he loved, were the architects of his nightmare. Officer Miller clenched his fists. His jaw was tight with 27 years of suppressed rage. He had sat across from Arthur. He had poured him coffee. He had promised the man he would find his daughter. "He took her during her lunch break," Miller said, his voice hard and focused. "That means he only had a few hours before the school called him. He couldn't have driven far to dispose of the body. He had to hide her somewhere fast, somewhere he had complete control over." Leo slowly lowered his hands. His eyes were red, staring blankly at the table. A memory, buried deep in his childhood trauma, suddenly clawed its way to the surface. "The barn," Leo whispered. Miller and David both looked at him. "The week after my mom disappeared, the police stopped searching the woods," Leo said, his voice trembling. "Arthur told my grandmother and me that he needed to keep busy. He said his mind was going crazy. He locked himself in the old barn behind their farmhouse for 3 days. He said he was pouring a new concrete floor for a workshop. Miller stood up from the booth so fast that his knee slammed into the table, rattling the coffee cups. "Do you still own that property?" Miller demanded. "Yes," Leo said, nodding slowly. "When my grandmother died, she left the house to me. I never sold it. I couldn't bear to go back there. It's just been sitting empty for 10 years. "Get your keys," Miller said, his eyes burning with absolute determination. "We are going there right now." 15 minutes later, the 3 men were driving down the dark, winding rural roads of Oak Creek. The rain was coming down harder now, washing over the windshield in heavy sheets. Leo sat in the passenger seat of Miller's truck, staring out into the darkness. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a hammer. He was terrified of what they were going to find, but he knew he could not stop. He owed it to his mother. He owed it to the woman who sacrificed everything, who lived in a nightmare just to keep him safe. They pulled onto the old dirt driveway of the Jenkins farmhouse. The house loomed in the darkness, a decaying silhouette against the stormy sky. The windows were boarded up, and the front porch was sagging under the weight of time. But they didn't go to the house. Miller parked the truck near the back of the property, its headlights shining directly onto the large, weathered wooden doors of the old barn. The 3 men stepped out into the freezing rain. Miller reached into the back of his truck and pulled out 2 heavy flashlights and a long, steel crowbar. David grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from his own trunk. They walked up to the barn doors. A heavy rusted padlock held them shut. Miller didn't hesitate. He swung the crowbar, smashing the padlock with a loud, metallic crack. The lock broke, and Leo pushed the heavy doors open. The smell of dry rot, old motor oil, and damp earth hit them instantly. The air inside the barn was stale and suffocating. Miller clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the bright beam of light across the empty space. There were old wooden workbenches covered in dust, rusty tools hanging on the walls, and a broken tractor sitting in the corner. But the floor was what drew their attention. The barn was massive, and most of the floor was packed dirt. But in the far back corner near the workbenches, there was a square section of solid concrete, about 10 feet wide and 10 feet long. They walked slowly toward it. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet barn. Leo stopped at the edge of the concrete. The surface was smooth, but there were faint, uneven ridges near the center, as if the cement had been rushed, smoothed over quickly by a frantic hand. David stepped forward, holding the heavy sledgehammer in both hands. He looked at Leo, waiting for permission. Leo closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. David raised the sledgehammer high above his head and brought it down with massive force. The heavy steel head slammed into the center of the concrete slab. A loud, echoing boom rang out through the barn, followed by a sharp crack. He swung again and again. Dust exploded into the air. Sharp pieces of concrete flew across the room. David hit the floor 5 more times before stepping back, panting heavily. Miller got down on his knees and shined his flashlight into the shattered crater. He used his gloved hands to pull away chunks of broken cement. Underneath the thick layer of concrete, there wasn't dirt. There was a thick layer of heavy, black industrial plastic, wrapped tightly with metal chains. Miller brushed the remaining concrete dust off the plastic. He looked up at Leo, his face pale and completely drained of color in the harsh beam of the flashlight. "Leo," Miller whispered, his voice catching in his throat, "we found her." The rain battered the tin roof of the old barn, but inside the world had completely stopped. Leo stared at the thick black plastic buried in the shattered concrete. The breath left his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold, dusty floor of the barn. 27 years of waiting, hopping, and wondering all crashed down onto his shoulders in a single second. The mother he had searched for every day of his childhood was not lost. She had not abandoned him. She had been right here. For years, Leo had walked into this very barn to fetch tools for his grandfather. He had played in the yard just a few feet away. He had sat at his grandfather's dinner table, eating the food paid for by the man who had stolen his mother's life. The horrific reality of that betrayal was too heavy to carry. Leo buried his face in his hands, and a loud, agonizing cry echoed through the empty barn. It was the sound of a little boy who had finally found his mother, decades too late. Officer Miller did not say a word. He slowly sank to his knees beside Leo and wrapped his arms around the younger man's shaking shoulders. Miller closed his eyes, and tears streamed down his own weathered cheeks. He had spent his entire career haunted by the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins. He had questioned every suspect, chased every dead end, and blamed himself for failing to protect her. Now, looking at the black plastic wrapped in heavy metal chains, the crushing weight of his failure mixed with a profound sense of relief. The search was finally over. David, the private investigator's son, stood quietly in the shadows. He took off his damp raincoat and bowed his head out of deep respect. He had brought the truth into the light, but the truth was a devastating thing to witness. Miller eventually stood up. He walked out into the pouring rain, stood by his truck, and picked up his police radio. His hands were shaking as he called the state police dispatch. He requested a full forensic team, crime scene investigators, and the county coroner. His voice was thick with emotion, but it was steady. He was going to make sure this scene was handled perfectly. Within 30 minutes, the quiet, rural dirt road was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of over a dozen police cruisers. The rain continued to fall heavily, reflecting the emergency lights across the wet grass. The Jenkins farmhouse, which had sat empty and dark for years, was suddenly the center of a massive criminal investigation. Yellow crime scene tape was strung around the perimeter of the barn. Large, industrial floodlights were carried inside, casting a harsh, bright white light over the shattered concrete floor. Men and women wearing white protective suits moved carefully around the crater. They worked slowly and methodically, treating the ground with the utmost respect. Leo was escorted out of the barn by a young female deputy. She wrapped a warm gray blanket around his shoulders and guided him to the passenger seat of an ambulance to get out of the freezing rain. Leo sat there, numb and completely exhausted. He watched the investigators carrying equipment back and forth. It felt like he was trapped in a terrible dream, but the cold wind hitting his face reminded him that this was entirely real. The excavation took hours. The forensic team had to carefully chip away the remaining pieces of jagged concrete without damaging the evidence underneath. As the sun began to rise, painting the gray morning sky with soft streaks of purple and pink, the medical examiner gently lifted the remains out of the dirt. The heavy metal chains were carefully cut away. The black industrial plastic was slowly unwrapped. Inside, the team found the skeletal remains of a woman, but they found something else, too. Something that completely shattered whatever emotional walls Officer Miller had left. Tucked inside the front pocket of the clothing the victim had been wearing, preserved by the tight plastic wrapping, was a small piece of folded paper. It was stained and deeply faded, but the crayon markings on the paper were still visible. The medical examiner carefully unfolded it using a pair of tweezers. Officer Miller leaned in to look. It was a drawing of a rocket ship flying through space. At the bottom, written in the messy, uneven handwriting of a 7-year-old boy, were the words, "I love you, Mom." It was the drawing Leo had made for her on the morning of October 12, 1993. It was the very last thing she had touched before Arthur Jenkins had forced her into his car. She had kept it close to her heart in her final moments. A few days later, the official DNA test results came back from the state crime laboratory. They confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains found under the concrete floor belonged to Margaret Collins, the woman the town of Oak Creek had known as Sarah Jenkins. The medical examiner also determined the cause of death. There was blunt force trauma to the back of her skull. The timeline became perfectly clear. Arthur had confronted her in the alleyway beside the auto repair shop. When she fought back, trying to escape so she could pick up her son, he struck her. He then hid her body, drove her car to the abandoned parking lot to make it look like she had run away, and went home to pour a concrete slab in his barn. The town of Oak Creek was paralyzed by the news. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page, and national news networks quickly picked it up. People who had lived in the town for decades were completely horrified. They had known Arthur Jenkins. They had sat next to him at the diner. They had offered him their condolences when his daughter-in-law went missing. They had attended his funeral and told stories about what a good, hard-working man he was. The realization that they had been living alongside a cold-blooded murderer shook the community to its absolute core. Arthur had played the part of the grieving grandfather perfectly. He had manipulated the police, the town, and his own grandson. But worst of all, the truth vindicated Sarah. For 27 years, people had whispered awful things about her. They had called her a runaway mother. They had speculated that she was selfish, that she had abandoned her little boy because she was tired of the responsibility. The police department held a massive press conference on the steps of the local courthouse. Officer Miller, dressed in his formal uniform despite being retired, stood at the podium. A dozen microphones were placed in front of him, and the flash of camera bulbs lit up the square. Miller looked out at the crowd of reporters and local citizens. His voice rang out clear and strong. For nearly 3 decades, the name of Sarah Jenkins has been spoken with a question mark, Miller announced, gripping the sides of the wooden podium. People wondered how a mother could walk away from her child. Today, we have the answer. She never walked away. Miller paused, letting the silence settle over the crowd. She was a victim of domestic terror, Miller continued. She changed her name to protect her son. She lived in constant fear, working a modest job, doing everything in her power to provide a safe, loving home for her little boy. When she tried to escape the man who was tormenting her, she was murdered. She was a hero. She gave her life to keep her child out of the hands of a monster. Today, we clear her name completely. Today, we bring her home. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. The dark cloud that had hung over the town for a quarter of a century was finally lifted. 2 weeks later, the sky above Oak Creek was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees were beginning to turn green again, signaling the arrival of spring. A quiet, beautiful funeral was held at the local cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. It was not a massive event, but the people who truly mattered were there. Leo stood at the front of the small gathering, wearing a dark suit. Officer Miller stood faithfully by his side, just as he had done on the night Leo had waited in the diner. David had driven back up from Florida to attend, bringing a beautiful wreath of white roses. Even Mrs. Gable, Leo's second-grade teacher, was there. She was much older now, walking with a cane, but she had never forgotten the little boy left sitting alone on the green wooden bench. A beautiful, polished oak casket rested above the open grave. Leo stepped forward. He placed his hand gently on the smooth wood of the casket. He felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace wash over his heart. The terrible, agonizing emptiness that had lived inside him since he was 7 years old was finally gone. It was replaced by a profound understanding of how deeply he was loved. He looked down at the beautiful granite headstone that had been placed at the head of the grave. He had chosen the words himself. He wanted the world to know the truth about the woman buried beneath it. The stone read, Margaret Collins, known to the world as Sarah Jenkins. A brave survivor, a heroic mother. She kept her promise. Leo took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. He looked at Officer Miller, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Then, Leo placed a single red rose on top of the casket. I love you, Mom, Leo whispered softly into the quiet breeze. You can rest now. We're both safe. As the casket was slowly lowered into the earth, The final chapter of the Oak Creek mystery officially closed. The dark, terrifying shadow of Arthur Jenkins was destroyed forever, erased by the undeniable power of the truth. The old farmhouse and the barn were eventually torn down. Leo sold the land, and the new owners planted a massive field of bright yellow sunflowers over the spot where the barn used to stand. Nature reclaimed the darkness, turning a place of horror into a place of life and light. Leo went back to his life, but he was a changed man. The sadness that had always lingered in his eyes vanished. He continued to teach science, but he now spoke to his students with a new sense of joy and purpose. He knew exactly who he was, and he knew the incredible strength of the woman who had given him life. The story of the single mother who vanished after dropping off her son is a dark reminder of the evil that can hide behind the friendly faces in our own neighborhoods. It is a terrifying example of how someone can live a lie so perfectly that an entire town believes it. But more than anything else, it is a story about the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Secrets can be buried under thick concrete. Lies can be told for decades. Evidence can be hidden in locked metal boxes. But the truth is like a slow-burning fire. It cannot be smothered forever. Eventually, it will always find its way back into the light. And when it does, it reminds us that love in its purest form is stronger than any darkness. It is a force that reaches across time, across decades, and across the boundaries of death itself to make sure that a promise is always kept.